What if, in the most desperate moment of your life, your only hope wasn't a person or a lawyer, but a dog? Michael sat in the cold, dark cell, his heart heavy with the weight of an unjust accusation. The courtroom had been relentless, the evidence twisted, and his words drowned out by the echo of false testimony. His death penalty was imminent. No one believed him. No one but his loyal companion, Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was a Border Collie, known for his remarkable intelligence and unwavering loyalty. As the days dragged on, Michael clung to the comfort of his companion. Through every sleepless night, Max was by his side, his eyes full of understanding, as if he knew something Michael didn't. It was strange how a dog could seem to understand the depths of despair, the weight of a broken heart. But Max, in his own quiet way, never once left Michael's side, even as the walls seemed to close in around them. The trial had ended, and now, as Michael awaited his fate, Max's presence was his only solace. Every sound in the prison echoed off the stone walls, every movement of the guards a reminder that time was running out. The court had already passed its judgment. The world had already decided that Michael was guilty. But Max still believed. In his heart, Michael wasn't guilty, and he was determined to prove it. What if Max, in the final hours, could change everything? What if the smartest dog alive could see something no one else could? What if the true hero was not a person, but a dog with the heart of a lion? The story had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than Michael ever imagined. As the judge prepared to announce the verdict, the room grew tense. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, and Michael felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. The gavel had already been raised, and the court was ready to sentence him to death. His mind raced, trying to find some shred of hope, but it felt like all avenues had been exhausted. The last few days had been a blur of accusations, angry lawyers, and biased testimonies. No one had listened to his side. It felt like he was already standing in the shadow of the execution chamber. At the front, the prosecutor smirked, clearly believing victory was within his grasp. Michael's lawyer had given up. The court seemed set on delivering the death penalty, with the crowd murmuring in agreement. The injustice was suffocating, yet Michael's only companion, Max, sat silently by his side, his gaze fixed and calm, as though he knew something Michael couldn't yet grasp. But then, just as the judge's hand hovered over the gavel, there was a commotion in the courtroom. A voice, rising above the rest, cut through the noise. It was Sarah, the lawyer who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to uncover the truth. She stood up, her voice shaking with urgency. "Wait, please! I have something that could change everything." The courtroom fell silent, the eyes of everyone now turning toward her. For a brief moment, Michael felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly drowned by the chaos around her. The prosecutor's glare grew colder, and murmurs filled the room. The judge, his patience thin, looked at her with disdain. "This is not the time for games, Miss Sarah. The verdict is final. We're moving forward." Sarah's heart raced as she fought to make herself heard. The papers she held in her hands felt like they were weighing her down, the truth pressing against her chest, suffocating. She had spent weeks reviewing every piece of evidence, every shred of testimony. She knew what she had was crucial, but no one was listening. The room was in disarray, the voices of those in favor of the death penalty rising once again. Her mind flashed back to the key pieces of evidence she had uncovered, all of which pointed to Michael's innocence. But how could she make them believe her in time? The sound of the gavel echoed in her mind, threatening to end everything. Desperation gripped her, but just as she was about to back down, Max's bark cut through the courtroom, loud and sharp. It was as if the dog, sensing the shift in her energy, knew the truth was just within reach. And in that instant, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What if Max, the one being who had never given up on Michael, was trying to tell them something? What if he knew more than they all thought? The puzzle wasn't just about the evidence. It was about understanding who, or what, was pointing them toward the real truth. As the tension in the courtroom reached its peak, the judge raised his gavel, preparing to deliver the final verdict. Michael's heart sank deeper, every beat echoing his fear of the inevitable. The room fell into a silence, filled with only the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional clearing of throats. The prosecutor's cold smile was the last thing Michael could see. His hope, like the fading light of a sunset, was nearly gone. His fate felt sealed as everyone braced for the unthinkable. But then, something unexpected happened. Max, the Border Collie, who had been quietly sitting by Michael's side, suddenly stood up. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and his eyes began darting around the room. He started pacing, his paws clicking against the hard courtroom floor. It was an odd behavior, especially for a dog as calm and intelligent as Max. This wasn't just an ordinary reaction. Max, who had always been composed and alert, was agitated, more than Michael had ever seen him before. At first, no one seemed to notice. The courtroom was consumed by the impending judgment, all eyes focused on the judge. But slowly, some of the onlookers began to catch sight of Max's strange behavior. A few jurors exchanged confused glances. Others leaned in, observing the dog's unusual movements. Max wasn't simply walking around. He was moving in circles, his eyes locked onto the judge, the prosecutor, and even the defense table. It was almost as if he was searching, as if he knew something the humans in the room couldn't see. Michael's breath caught in his chest as he watched Max. It was as though the dog sensed something was about to happen. Max's pacing grew more frantic, his tail twitching nervously, a soft whine escaping his throat. He stopped once in front of the prosecutor's table, sniffing the air as if trying to decipher an invisible clue. Then he turned sharply, his gaze locking onto Sarah, Michael's lawyer. There was a flash of recognition in Max's eyes. He knew she was the last chance, the only one who could save Michael now. As Max continued his agitated pacing, the courtroom started to murmur. A few heads turned and whispers spread like wildfire. Could the dog sense something? Could he be aware of a detail that had slipped through everyone's notice? The tension in the room grew even more palpable as Max's behavior became impossible to ignore. Something was wrong. Something was about to change, and Max seemed to be the only one who could feel it. Max was no ordinary dog. He had always been different. From the moment Michael had adopted him, he knew there was something special about the Border Collie. Max had a sharpness in his eyes, a curiosity that seemed to stretch far beyond the usual bounds of a dog's understanding. Michael had seen it countless times. In fact, it was Max's intelligence that had first caught his attention. Back when Michael was still living a normal life, Max had often impressed him with his ability to solve complex puzzles. Those games meant for humans, where the pieces had to be carefully arranged or matched. Whether it was finding his way through intricate mazes or locating lost items Michael had hidden around the house, Max was always a step ahead. He had an uncanny ability to remember things no one would expect a dog to remember. A misplaced set of keys, a forgotten note, even where Michael had last placed his phone. All of these things Max could track down in a heartbeat. It wasn't just about finding things, though. Max could read Michael's emotions like no one else. He knew when Michael was anxious, frustrated, or simply downcast. When things were tough, when life felt like it was closing in on Michael, Max would nudge him gently, offering his quiet companionship. He was Michael's protector, his silent supporter, and above all, his best friend. But in that courtroom, Max's behavior was different. The usual calm intelligence that defined him was replaced by something more primal, more urgent. His pacing was frantic, as if he was trying to alert everyone around him to a truth they couldn't see. Max wasn't just sensing Michael's despair, he was sensing the deep injustice that hung in the air like a storm cloud. It was as if the dog understood the gravity of the situation, that the man he loved, the man who had always cared for him, was about to be lost to a mistake, a lie, and Max wasn't going to let that happen. As the courtroom's energy grew more tense, Max's instinctive intelligence kicked into overdrive. He could feel the weight of the injustice pressing in, and his sharp mind began to connect the dots. This wasn't just a case of loyalty, it was a case of understanding the truth. Max, in his silent way, seemed to know that something was about to break wide open. But what exactly? What was the key? Was there something in the room, some hidden clue that only Max could recognize? The bond between Michael and Max was stronger than ever, and it was clear now that Max wasn't going to rest until he had exposed the truth. Sarah had spent countless sleepless nights poring over the details of Michael's case. The evidence, the testimonies, the documents, she'd gone over them all 100 times. She was convinced of his innocence. Every time she reviewed the facts, it became more and more clear that Michael had been wrongly accused. But despite her tireless efforts, something was missing. There was one crucial piece of evidence that could prove Michael's innocence beyond any doubt. And she couldn't find it. The prosecutor's case was airtight, at least on the surface. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to condemn Michael. Sarah knew that. Had she been able to uncover that one final piece, the case would be blown wide open. But where was it? What had she overlooked? As the trial continued, Sarah's frustration grew. She knew Michael didn't belong here, that the truth was out there somewhere, but the clock was ticking. The court was already growing impatient, the whispers of a guilty verdict growing louder. The pressure on her was overwhelming. Every passing minute felt like a lifetime. She had to find it. She couldn't let an innocent man be sent to his death. But that crucial piece of evidence, it eluded her. It wasn't in the paperwork, it wasn't in the testimony, and it certainly wasn't in the statements of the witnesses. The one thing Sarah hadn't considered, something so simple, so obvious, was right under her nose. She leaned back in her chair, running her hands through her hair in frustration. That's when it hit her. The answer wasn't going to come from the usual places. The solution wasn't locked in the mountains of paperwork or the testimonies of the witnesses. It was in the smallest details. Sarah had always believed in the power of observation, and suddenly, she knew where she had to look. As her gaze flickered toward Max, Michael's loyal Border Collie, she noticed the dog's odd behavior. His eyes were fixed on something, his movements sharp and deliberate. Could it be? Was Max trying to tell her something? The more she watched, the more it became clear. Max wasn't just agitated for no reason. The dog had picked up on something. Maybe, just maybe, he had found the key piece Sarah had been searching for all along. But what was it? Max's instincts were sharper than anything Sarah could have ever imagined. Could this dog, with his remarkable intelligence, hold the key to Michael's freedom? Max's pacing became more erratic with each passing second. He was no longer just walking in circles. He was deliberately darting from one part of the courtroom to the next, his eyes scanning the room with intense focus. His paws clicked against the hard floor, each step adding weight to the growing tension in the air. As Sarah watched, her heart pounded in her chest. Was Max trying to tell her something? Was this some sort of signal? The strange behavior was unsettling, yet there was an undeniable urgency to it. Then, without warning, Max stopped dead in his tracks. His body went still, his gaze fixed firmly on something. Something in the middle of the courtroom table, just beyond the prosecutor's desk. Sarah's eyes followed the dog's focus. There, lying among some scattered papers and objects, was a small, seemingly insignificant object, a broken pen. Max's attention to the pen was like a flash of lightning in Sarah's mind. For a moment, she was paralyzed. The pen? How could such a simple object be important? She glanced at Michael. His face was full of confusion, the stress of the situation weighing heavily on him. But Sarah's mind was racing now, every thought becoming laser-focused on the broken pen Max had singled out. She quickly stood up, her heart pounding in her ears, and made her way toward the table. As she picked up the pen, she felt a cold chill run down her spine. The pen, though broken, wasn't ordinary. There were fingerprints on it, smudged and slightly blurred, but unmistakable. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers trembling as the realization began to dawn. This was it. This was the piece of evidence that had been missing, the key to unlocking Michael's innocence. The fingerprints on the pen weren't Michael's. They weren't even close to his. They were from someone else, someone who had been involved in the crime, someone who had been overlooked in the rush to judgment. The prosecutor had dismissed it, the defense had missed it, and it had almost been buried in the chaos of the trial. But Max had found it. Max had known from the very beginning that this was the truth the court needed. His sharp instincts had led Sarah to the broken pen, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. Max's strange behavior wasn't just a random act of agitation. It was the dog's way of telling her that the evidence was right in front of her all along. Max had found the missing piece, and now it was up to Sarah to make sure the truth was finally heard. As Sarah held the broken pen, her hands trembling with a mix of disbelief and excitement, Max's behavior took a strange turn. The dog, who had been calm moments before, was now acting with purpose. He didn't bark or whine. Instead, He nudged the pen gently with his nose, as if urging her to pay closer attention to it. His eyes, usually calm and measured, were now full of intent, his focus unyielding. It was as if Max was trying to communicate something that Sarah had missed the first time. She watched in stunned silence as Max's nose pushed the pen further toward her. He wasn't just playing or pawing at it. He was guiding it, directing her attention. The more Sarah stared at the pen, the more she began to feel the weight of the moment. Max's actions, though subtle, were deliberate. He knew something she didn't. Her mind raced. The pen. Where had she seen that pen before? What had been said about it during the trial? Her memory flickered back to a conversation she'd had with the detective just days before. He had mentioned a pen found at the crime scene. It was an unusual pen, one with a distinct marking that didn't match any of the victim's personal items. But more importantly, it wasn't mentioned in the official police report. It had been overlooked. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This pen, this simple object that Max had led her to, wasn't just any pen. It was the key to unraveling the entire case. The real culprit, the one who had framed Michael, had used this pen to plant evidence at the scene, attempting to make it look like Michael had been involved. The fingerprints on the pen weren't Michael's, but they were someone else's. The person who had orchestrated the crime and set Michael up to take the fall. Max's nudging of the pen wasn't just an act of coincidence. He had known all along. He had somehow sensed that this pen was crucial, and he had guided Sarah's hand toward it, as if to say, "This is it. This is the truth." The realization hit Sarah like a wave. The case wasn't lost. It wasn't over. The final piece of evidence had been sitting in front of her all along, just waiting to be uncovered. The broken pen, now in her hands, was about to change everything. Max's intelligence had led them here. And with this revelation, Sarah knew she had the evidence she needed to prove Michael's innocence once and for all. With the broken pen in her hand, Sarah's heart raced. The realization had struck her like a lightning bolt. This was it. This was the piece of evidence that would finally clear Michael's name. Max had led her to it, and now it was time to make sure everyone in the courtroom understood its significance. Without wasting another second, she rushed toward the judge's bench, the pen clutched tightly in her hand. Her breath was shallow, her mind swirling with the gravity of what she was about to do. The room was filled with murmurs as Sarah approached, the gavel raised and the judge preparing to deliver the final sentence. She didn't hesitate. "Your Honor," she called, her voice cutting through the noise. The courtroom fell into a sudden silence, all eyes now on her. The prosecutor's smirk faltered as Sarah held up the pen for everyone to see. The judge looked down at the pen, his face puzzled. He wasn't sure what he was looking at, but the urgency in Sarah's voice made him pause. "What is this?" he asked, his tone skeptical but curious. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was her moment, the moment she had worked so tirelessly for. "This," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "This pen was found at the crime scene. But it wasn't Michael's. It belongs to someone else, someone who framed him." She looked directly at the prosecutor, whose confidence had suddenly started to waver. "The fingerprints on this pen don't belong to Michael. They belong to the real culprit, the person who set him up and planted false evidence." The room was still as Sarah's words hung in the air. Her explanation made sense, but the implications were staggering. If what she was saying was true, Michael hadn't just been wrongly accused. He had been actively framed. The realization started to sink in for everyone in the room, the weight of the injustice settling heavily upon them. The judge leaned forward, his brows furrowed in confusion. "But if Michael didn't commit the crime, who did?" he asked, his voice low, almost fearful. The room grew even quieter, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers as the prosecutor nervously looked around, trying to maintain composure. "The real criminal is still out there," Sarah replied, her voice firm. "And Michael is innocent." She turned to look at Michael, his face a mixture of disbelief and hope. The room was still reeling from the revelation, the silence heavy with the realization that they had been wrong all along. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place of judgment. It had become the battleground for justice. And the truth was finally beginning to break free. Max's sudden shift in behavior was unmistakable. It was as if a light had gone on in his mind, a spark of clarity that made everything fall into place. The confusion that had clouded his actions moments earlier evaporated, replaced by something more focused, more determined. He wasn't just pacing now, he was moving with purpose. His sharp eyes never left the broken pen, and he moved between Sarah and Michael, his every step deliberate, as if to guide them toward the next step of their journey. Max had always been intelligent, but now, in this moment, he was acting with a precision that was almost human. Sarah watched in awe as the Border Collie, the loyal companion, seemed to understand the urgency of the situation in ways no one else could. The room had gone quiet, the realization of Michael's innocence starting to sink in. But there was still work to be done. The truth had been uncovered. But Max knew it wasn't over yet. The real criminal was still out there, and the case wasn't truly resolved until the person who had framed Michael was caught. Max's actions made it clear that he wasn't going to rest until the whole story was revealed. With his tail low and his body tense, he moved toward the prosecutor's table. His nose twitched as if he was picking up a scent. Sarah's eyes widened. She had seen Max do this before. Track a scent, follow a trail, solve a puzzle that others couldn't. She knew now that Max wasn't just reacting to the broken pen or the evidence. It was something deeper. He was hunting for the truth, and he was determined to see it through. Max approached the prosecutor's table, his steps slowing as he sniffed around the area. His eyes darted back to Sarah, then to Michael, and back to the prosecutor. It was as if he had discovered something else, a piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet been uncovered. He barked once, sharply, before stepping back, then looked up at Sarah, his gaze full of purpose. For a brief moment, the courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing the pressure mounting. Max's behavior wasn't just an accident. He was onto something important, something that would lead them to the real criminal. With renewed urgency, Sarah turned to the judge. "We need to investigate further," she said, her voice firm. Max had shown them the path, and now it was time to follow it. The dog had done his part, but the final chase was just beginning. Max's actions, now more purposeful than ever, led Sarah's thoughts down an unexpected path. His unwavering focus on the prosecutor's table had triggered something in her memory. Sarah's mind began to race, searching through the months of investigation, trying to recall any moment that could be connected to Max's instincts. And then it hit her. A moment long forgotten, buried under the weight of endless paperwork and trial preparation. During one of Michael's earlier visits to the courthouse, Sarah had noticed something peculiar. Max, ever the perceptive companion, had behaved oddly when they passed a particular man in the hall. Max had stopped suddenly, his nose twitching, his body stiffening as he sniffed the man's coat with intense concentration. At the time, Sarah had brushed it off as the dog simply reacting to an unfamiliar scent. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, Sarah realized it had been far more than that. Max's keen sense of smell and sharp memory had picked up on something that no one else had. The man, he had seemed like an ordinary visitor to the courthouse, just another face in the crowd. But in that moment, Max had reacted with a level of suspicion that Sarah couldn't ignore. She remembered how she had dismissed it, assuming it was a coincidence. How could a simple sniffing of a coat be important? But now, in the context of everything that had happened, she realized it was crucial. Max had sensed something about that man, a connection that neither she nor Michael had recognized at the time. With renewed determination, Sarah scanned the room, her eyes searching for the man from that day. She saw him, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, his face neutral, blending in with the other spectators. But now, with Max's instincts guiding her, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the man was hiding something. He wasn't just another bystander. He was part of the story, part of the plan to frame Michael. Sarah turned to Max, her heart racing. The dog was still fixated on the man, his gaze unwavering. Max had made the connection, and now it was up to Sarah to uncover the truth. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. The real culprit had been right under their noses the entire time, and Max had led them to him. Now, it was time to expose him for the criminal he was. The hunt for justice was far from finished. As Sarah's mind raced with the realization that the man Max had sensed was connected to the case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. Max's eyes never left the suspicious figure, his tail rigid and his posture alert, as if he was waiting for something. Then, without warning, Max let out a sharp bark, a sound that pierced the silence of the room and caught everyone's attention. His sudden outburst was enough to break the quiet murmur of the spectators and send a ripple of confusion through the courtroom. Without hesitation, Max darted forward, running toward a specific person in the back of the room. His legs moved with purpose, and his eyes were fixed on the figure in the crowd. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been watching the man, but she hadn't anticipated Max's reaction. As the dog neared, Sarah realized who it was. There, sitting quietly and unobtrusively, was a reporter who had been attending the trial, taking notes and observing from the sidelines. Max's behavior was unmistakable. The dog wasn't simply barking out of instinct or irritation. He was reacting to something he knew, something crucial. Max stopped right in front of the reporter, his stance firm and his gaze unwavering. He sat down in front of the man, eyes locked on him, as if demanding that the truth be revealed. The room fell into a stunned silence, all eyes now on the dog and the reporter. The reporter, clearly startled, stood up and looked at Max for a moment before turning to Sarah. He hesitated, as if unsure of what to say. But the tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah wasted no time. She stepped forward, her voice steady but urgent. "What do you know about this case?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the reporter. For a moment, the reporter didn't speak. Then, with a deep breath, he looked around the courtroom. "I never came forward," he began, his voice low but clear. "But I saw the real culprit the day of the crime. I was there. He was the one who planted the evidence, the one who framed Michael." The words sent a shockwave through the room. Sarah's heart raced as the reporter continued. He described the man, the one who had been in the courthouse that day, the same man Max had pointed to. The reporter had seen him leave the scene, his movements suspicious and hurried, just after the crime was committed. The realization was staggering. The real criminal, the one who had framed Michael, had been hiding in plain sight. But now, with the reporter's testimony, everything was about to change. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was finally coming to light. Max, with his sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty, had led them here. The battle wasn't over yet, but this was the turning point they had all been waiting for. As the reporter's words echoed through the courtroom, the air grew thick with tension. Every eye was on him now, hanging on to every word he spoke. Max sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving the reporter, as though the dog knew this moment was pivotal in the unraveling of the entire case. Sarah stood, heart racing, as the reporter continued his recount. "I saw him," the reporter said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his confession. "The man who framed Michael. I was at the courthouse that day, taking my usual notes, and I noticed him. He was with Michael just before the crime took place. They were talking, and Michael seemed confused by something the man said. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after seeing the news and hearing about Michael's arrest, it all clicked. I should have come forward sooner." Sarah's mind began to race, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that felt almost too surreal. This man, the reporter had described, was the same person Max had sensed. He was the one who had framed Michael, planting evidence at the scene to make it look like Michael was guilty. And now, with the reporter's testimony, everything was falling into place. She looked down at Max, his posture firm and unyielding. His instincts had led them to this moment. The dog had always been alert, sharp, and precise. But now it was clear that his sense of justice, his understanding of what had happened, had guided them through the maze of lies and half-truths to the undeniable truth. Sarah quickly turned back to the reporter, pressing for more details. "Tell me about the conversation you overheard. What exactly did this man say to Michael?" The reporter nodded, his eyes wide as he recalled the moment. He was telling Michael something about a deal, something that sounded off. I didn't hear all of it, but Michael looked uncomfortable. He tried to walk away, but the man followed him. That's when I noticed the pen, the same one Max pointed out. The man had it in his hand when I saw him leave the scene. The room seemed to hold its breath. Max's instincts had led them to this moment. to this man. Sarah felt the weight of the revelation settle in her chest. The case wasn't just about clearing Michael's name anymore. It was about catching the real criminal, the one who had carefully orchestrated everything, and now, with the reporter's help, they had him. The pieces were falling into place, and the trial was taking a turn no one had expected. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, and Max, with his sharp instincts, had shown them the way. The room was still buzzing with the shock of the reporter's revelation when the tension suddenly shifted. As Sarah absorbed the gravity of the situation, the man Max had been pointing to, the real culprit, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted nervously between the people in the courtroom, trying to stay composed, but the weight of the situation was bearing down on him. He realized, in that instant, that Max and Sarah were onto him. The truth was about to catch up to him. Without a moment's hesitation, the man stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. He began moving quickly, making his way toward the exit, his face flushed with panic. He was attempting to flee. He knew the walls were closing in, and he could feel the courtroom's eyes on him. But as he reached the door, something unexpected happened. Max, ever watchful, locked his eyes onto the man. Max's body tensed, his instincts sharp as ever. Without warning, the Border Collie barked loudly, a single sharp sound that reverberated through the room. It was a call to action, an alert that no one could ignore. Max shot to his feet, his focus unrelenting as he bolted toward the man trying to escape. The courtroom erupted into chaos, with gasps and shouts filling the air as people realized what was happening. The man, now scrambling toward the door, was being pursued by the very dog that had unearthed the truth. Max's speed was almost unreal, his movements fluid and precise. He was fast, focused, and determined. His body moved with purpose as he ran past spectators and lawyers alike, his barking growing louder and more insistent with every step. The real culprit, panic flashing in his eyes, reached the door and tried to wrench it open, but he was too slow. As Max closed in on him, the man's hesitation became his downfall. He turned around to face the dog, but before he could react, Max leapt forward, his teeth bared, ready to defend his owner. The man stumbled back, but just as he did, a pair of courtroom officers grabbed hold of him. They had been alerted by Max's barking, and they swiftly took control of the situation. The man was apprehended, his escape attempt thwarted by a dog's determination. Max stood beside Sarah, his body relaxed now that the danger was averted. His sharp eyes never left the man as he was escorted away, but the dog's loyalty and quick action had saved the day. The room fell into a stunned silence, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Max had not only led them to the truth, but had now ensured that the real criminal would face justice. With the real criminal now in custody, the tension in the courtroom slowly began to lift. But for Michael, it felt like his world had just been turned upside down. The man who had framed him was finally caught, and the death penalty that had loomed over him for days was no longer a threat. But as the weight of his freedom settled in, it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming rush of emotions. Michael's mind was still racing. The last few days a blur of confusion, fear, and a sense of helplessness that had consumed him. He had sat in that cold, dark cell, awaiting his fate, feeling the heavy weight of the world pressing in on him. He had believed deep down that he was innocent, but the overwhelming power of the accusations and the evidence against him had made him doubt himself. The fear of dying for something he didn't do had been suffocating, and yet the moment of his salvation felt almost unreal. Was this really happening? Had Max's unwavering loyalty and Sarah's determination truly saved him from the brink of death? Michael's chest tightened as the emotions surged within him. The disbelief was overpowering, followed by relief, and then the overwhelming realization of how close he had come to losing everything: the years of his life, his freedom, his future. It was a raw and fragile feeling, one that left him feeling weak, yet strangely alive. As his thoughts swirled, Max, ever loyal and intuitive, gently nudged him with his nose, breaking through the haze of Michael's emotions. The dog sat by his side, his eyes soft yet focused, offering a comfort that only an animal like Max could. Max had never left Michael's side throughout the entire ordeal. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable. The dog had known when Michael needed him most, offering the kind of quiet support that words could never express. Michael reached down, his hand trembling as he ran his fingers through Max's fur. He felt the warmth of the dog's body against his own, a simple gesture that grounded him in the moment. Max looked up at him with those knowing eyes, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." And for the first time in days, Michael felt that weight lift. The emotional storm that had raged inside him slowly began to settle. Max had done more than just help uncover the truth. He had kept Michael anchored, reminding him that despite the horrors of the past few days, there was still hope, still love, and still a future to rebuild. Michael wasn't alone anymore, not with Max by his side. As the final declaration of Michael's innocence echoed through the courtroom, the weight that had burdened him for so long seemed to lift. The room was filled with the murmur of relief and astonishment, but for Michael, everything else faded into the background. The only thing that mattered now was the quiet moment he shared with Max, the loyal companion who had stood by him through it all. As the judge's words sank in, Michael's eyes fell to the floor, unable to take in the reality of what had just transpired. He had been on the verge of losing everything: his life, his future, his very identity, and now it was all being restored. But it was Max, the dog who had never wavered in his belief, who had been his anchor. Through the chaos, the courtroom battles, the fear, and the confusion, Max had been the one constant, the one creature who had understood the depth of Michael's pain and fought for his innocence. Max, sensing that the storm had passed, walked calmly toward Michael, his eyes full of understanding. The dog didn't need to speak or offer words of comfort. His presence alone was enough. Michael dropped to his knees, reaching out to pull Max close. As his arms wrapped around the dog, he could feel the steady rhythm of Max's breathing, the warmth of his body. It was a comfort Michael hadn't realized he'd needed until this very moment. Max leaned into Michael, his tail wagging softly. There was no need for words. In that simple, quiet moment, they both understood what had just happened. Max hadn't just been a pet or a companion. He had been Michael's protector, his lifeline. The bond between them had transcended the ordinary connection between man and dog. It had been something deeper, something unspoken. Max had never given up on him, even when the rest of the world had turned their back. The dog had believed in Michael when no one else had. He had fought for him in ways that went beyond instinct. His actions had been driven by something that went beyond simple loyalty. Max had known, somehow, that the truth would come out and that Michael's innocence would be proven. As Michael held Max close, his emotions overwhelmed him. Tears welled up in his eyes, not just from relief, but from a deep sense of gratitude and love. Max had been more than a dog. He had been Michael's steadfast ally, the one who had never wavered. In that moment, Michael realized the full depth of their bond. They weren't just together by circumstance. They were connected by something far stronger. They were survivors, both of them, and they had faced the storm together. As the courtroom cleared and the flood of emotions slowly began to settle, Michael remained on his knees, his arms wrapped around Max, the dog who had just saved him. Max's steady presence, his calming energy, seemed to fill the room with a sense of peace that Michael hadn't felt in days. Despite everything he had gone through, the terror, the injustice, the hopelessness, he now understood that he was not alone. He had Max, and that was more than enough. Max's intelligence and loyalty had shone through in ways Michael couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just that Max had led them to the truth, or that he had shown remarkable instincts in uncovering the real criminal. It was that Max had been there, every step of the way, guiding Michael when no one else could. In those long, dark hours in his cell, Max had been the one to remind him that the fight wasn't over. The dog had believed in him when the world had turned its back. And now, as Michael stood on the edge of his freedom, he knew that Max's loyalty was not just a temporary measure. It was a bond forged through everything they had been through together. Michael looked at Max, the dog's gaze steady and wise, as if understanding everything Michael was feeling. There were no words exchanged between them. None were needed. In that single glance, Michael knew that Max would always be by his side, no matter what. Through every trial they would face in the future, through every heartbreak, through every victory, Max would be there. This was more than just a companionship. It was a bond built on mutual trust, unwavering loyalty, and love. No matter how many battles Michael would face, no matter how dark the road might get, Max would stand with him, just as he had when it seemed like all hope was lost. Tears welled up in Michael's eyes, but this time, they were not born of fear or despair. They were tears of gratitude, of a heart overwhelmed by the depth of the connection between them. Max wasn't just a dog. He was family, a protector, a friend, and a savior. The realization hit Michael hard. With Max by his side, there was nothing he couldn't face, nothing that would ever break their bond. In this moment of clarity, Michael finally understood that no matter what happened next, he was never truly alone. As the courtroom buzzed with the shock of the reporter's testimony and the realization of Michael's innocence, a quiet shift occurred. The tension in the room slowly morphed into something more palpable, a wave of gratitude, admiration, and awe. Michael was no longer just a man facing an unjust death sentence. He was a man freed by the intelligence and loyalty of his loyal companion. And that companion, Max, had just proven to be the hero of the hour. The first few murmurs spread throughout the room like wildfire. The judge, still seated behind his bench, couldn't hide a small smile, a glimmer of respect in his eyes as he looked down at the Border Collie. The prosecutor, once so confident in his case, stood silently, watching Max with a newfound sense of disbelief. And then, as if on cue, the courtroom erupted in applause. It wasn't just for Michael, though he too stood in stunned relief. The applause was for Max, the dog who had never wavered in his loyalty, who had fought for Michael's life with nothing but instinct and a bond that went deeper than words. The applause echoed through the room, filling every corner, vibrating with the energy of an audience finally understanding the extraordinary role Max had played in this courtroom drama. Max's ears perked up at the sound of the clapping, his tail beginning to wag slowly at first, unsure of what was happening. The dog's eyes darted around, taking in the scene with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. He didn't understand the significance of the applause, but the rhythm of the clapping, the excitement in the air, was enough to get him excited. He wagged his tail more vigorously, a proud, albeit confused, smile on his face as he looked at Michael. Michael couldn't help but laugh softly, his chest still heavy with emotion. He reached down, scratching behind Max's ears as the dog turned to look up at him, his eyes bright and trusting. Max, in that moment, didn't fully grasp why everyone was clapping. He didn't understand that he had saved Michael's life. But what Max did know, what he could feel in his bones, was that his best friend was safe. And that was enough. The room continued to applaud, and Max, with his tail wagging furiously, looked up at Michael. There was no need for words. Max's joy, his pride in being able to help, was written all over his face. He had done his job, and now, in this moment, he was simply happy to be by Michael's side. He had given everything for this moment, and for Max, that was all that mattered. The applause slowly faded, but the quiet that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of everything Michael had just been through. He had been freed, but the relief that washed over him was bittersweet. Standing in that courtroom, Michael felt like a different person, a man who had just narrowly escaped the abyss. His heart still raced, and though the chains of his impending death sentence had been broken, something deep inside him had shifted. The experience, the fear, the overwhelming sense of helplessness had altered his perception of the world in ways he wasn't ready to fully grasp. As the courtroom emptied and the weight of the moment slowly began to sink in, Michael found himself alone for a brief moment. He stood still, his back against the cool stone walls, trying to make sense of everything. The faces of the people around him had blurred. The judge, the prosecutor, even the reporter, had all come and gone in a rush, leaving behind only fragments of conversation and the overwhelming thought that he had almost lost everything. But what really stayed with him was the way the justice system had failed him. He had trusted it to see the truth, to bring about justice. But instead, it had been a system that almost sentenced him to death based on lies and manipulation. The weight of that betrayal gnawed at him. How could he ever trust it again? How could he be certain that something like this wouldn't happen again? To someone else? To anyone? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft padding of Max's paws approaching him. The dog's presence was like an anchor, steady and unyielding, pulling Michael back from the swirling chaos in his mind. Max sat by his side, his warm body close, his head tilting upward to meet Michael's gaze. Michael's eyes softened as he reached down and gently scratched behind Max's ears, feeling the calming rhythm of the dog's steady breathing. Max was there. He had been there from the start, unwavering in his loyalty, his sharp intelligence guiding them to the truth. Michael felt a rush of gratitude. As much as the experience had shattered his belief in the system, Max had restored his faith in something more important: trust, loyalty, friendship, and love. With Max by his side, Michael knew he could face whatever came next. The questions about the future, the lingering doubts, the uncertainty, they were still there, hovering on the edges of his mind. But Max, his ever-present companion, was there too. And in that quiet, shared moment, Michael realized that whatever lay ahead, he wasn't facing it alone. And with that thought, he finally felt ready to move forward. Just as Michael began to process his newfound freedom, and the weight of the past few days started to settle into something resembling clarity, Sarah received a call that would change everything once again. She had been pacing outside the courthouse, her mind still racing over all that had transpired. Michael was safe, yes, but questions lingered in the air. Why had the real culprit framed him? What had driven someone to go to such lengths to see an innocent man condemned to death? Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she answered, it wasn't the familiar voice of a colleague or investigator. It was the voice of someone who had been silent throughout the entire trial, someone who had remained in the shadows, waiting. The voice on the other end was low, strained, and filled with a quiet urgency. "It's me," the voice began, and Sarah immediately knew who it was: the real criminal, the man who had framed Michael. He had been captured, yes, but now unexpectedly, he was speaking. "I need to tell you the truth," he continued, his tone almost pleading. "It was never about Michael. He was just a pawn, a means to an end." The words hit Sarah hard, sending a shiver down her spine. The man went on to explain that the true motive behind the false accusations wasn't about personal animosity toward Michael, but something far deeper: a business rivalry, long-hidden grudges, and a desire to protect personal interests that stretched far beyond Michael's life. The man had been pressured by a powerful figure, someone far above him, to set Michael up in order to cover up an even bigger crime. Michael had been chosen as the perfect scapegoat, someone who was vulnerable and had no means of fighting back. Sarah's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle shifted again, forming a new picture, one that was even more complicated than she had ever imagined. The criminal had been a tool, manipulated by forces that were much larger than the case itself. And as the man's confession continued, Sarah realized that Michael's wrongful conviction was only the surface of a much darker and more complex conspiracy. The truth, now fully revealed, had opened a new chapter in the battle for justice. This wasn't just about clearing Michael's name anymore. It was about uncovering the larger forces at play and holding those responsible accountable for the web of lies that had been spun around Michael. The case wasn't over. It had only just begun, and Sarah now had a new mission: to expose the truth and bring those who had orchestrated the plot to justice. With the weight of this revelation settling in, Sarah knew one thing for certain: the journey ahead would be far from easy. But with Michael's innocence proven and Max's loyalty still unwavering, they were ready for whatever came next. As the final revelation hung in the air and the courtroom began to empty, Michael felt a strange calm settling over him. The chaos of the past days, the fear, the heartache, the almost unbearable weight of his impending death sentence had finally come to an end. He was free. But this victory wasn't just a legal triumph. It was something much deeper. Something Michael couldn't fully explain, but felt in the core of his being. He stood up slowly, his legs still shaky, as if the shock of everything was finally catching up with him. But then he looked down. There, sitting patiently by his side, was Max, his loyal companion, the dog who had never wavered, who had never given up on him. Max looked up at him, his eyes calm and steady, as if to say, "We made it. Together." With a deep breath, Michael stepped toward the exit, his hand reaching down to stroke Max's head. The dog wagged his tail, his eyes full of pride and understanding. Michael felt a surge of gratitude, a deep sense of connection that went beyond words. In that moment, he realized that Max wasn't just a pet or even a companion, Max had become his protector, his savior, his best friend. The bond they shared wasn't one forged by circumstance. It was something that had been built through loyalty, intelligence, and an unbreakable love. As they walked out of the courtroom together, the weight of the world seemed to lift. The sun, which had felt so distant just days before, now shone brightly through the courthouse windows, casting a warm glow over them. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, but it wasn't a lonely sound. It was a sound of hope, of a new beginning. Michael and Max were walking into the future, side by side. Michael knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be obstacles to face, questions to answer, and justice to be sought. But with Max by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. For Michael, this wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where loyalty and love had triumphed over everything. No matter how dire the situation, no matter how impossible the odds, Max had proven something irrefutable. True friends never leave each other behind. As they stepped into the sunlight together, Michael understood that no matter what the future held, he would always have Max. And that was all he needed to face whatever came next.